Well, good morning, everybody. It's just gone 10 o'clock and we've got quite a few attendees on the session now. So I think we'll kick off. Thank you for signing into today's session. My name is Rhys Bradshaw, Associate Director in DLP's Rugby office. We usually run these events from the grander surroundings of Rugby School, and I'm sorry to say that I can't invite you to help yourself to a coffee and a breakfast roll this morning, but suffice to say that we all look forward to a time when that's possible once again. I'm delighted to welcome you to another of DLP Planning Limited's webinars this year, covering a range of practical planning issues. DLP operates out of a number of offices, including Bedford, Rugby, Milton Keynes, London, Nottingham, Sheffield and Bristol. We undertake a variety of projects on behalf of private and public sector clients on a wide range of planning projects. So we're aiming to complete today's webinar within the hour with around 45 minutes or so for the presentations themselves. We have a panel of 3 speakers for you this morning, and I'm very happy to welcome Stuart Tym, planning lawyer at Irwin Mitchell LLP, Peter Goatley QC, joint head of the planning group at number 5 Chambers, and our own Alex Roberts, Director of DLP's Strategic Planning Research Unit. So today we're going to focus on the West Midlands and the implications of planning for the future, the consultation for which has ended, in fact, on the 29th of October. Stuart is going to start the session with a community infrastructure levy top 5 hints and tips. Moving on to the SIL deferral scheme brought about by the coronavirus amendment regulations and the future for SIL following the publication of the white paper. Peter will move on to cover some of the key points of the paper as he sees them in his own unique way. And Alex will round up by digging deeper into the implications for housing numbers in the West Midlands. And then if we have time, we'll finish with some questions from the virtual floor. If we do run out of time, we will be mopping those questions up with the paper next week. Before we begin, it's just a couple of housekeeping points from me. Please feel free to raise any questions during the panel presentations using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. These will be monitored throughout and we will look to provide responses to as many questions as possible. If we can, we'll do that at the end of the session. If we do run out of time, as I say, we'll follow those up. If your connection does fail during the presentation, please seek to rejoin using the link that you joined a few moments ago. So Stuart, without further ado, over to you.
I think that's me off mute. Thanks, Rhys. Firstly, I'm doing my best to attempt a standing desk today. You can't see the ironing board underneath me, but it's the most used my ironing board's had all year. And I'm also doing Movember, as you've probably noticed. It isn't my normal facial attire. It's all for charity and the links are on my social media. If we flick to the next slide, this is just a quick overview of what I hope to go through in the next 15-20 minutes. It is quite a rapid bash through the changes to the SIL regs recently and what we think is coming up, together with a couple of top hints and tips for those really practicing this and having to deal with it day to day on the development side of things. So we're going to have a quick look at the 29 update to the SIL regs, some of the changes that came in last Christmas. These were in draft as a Christmas present 2018, and some of the effects of them are just coming into fruition now in 2020. An edited down version of our top 10 hints and tips, so top 5 for the timetable here. A couple of the quirks that have come out of SIL thanks to COVID-19 and the various lockdowns and difficulties the industry is having this year. And then a little look forward at what's in the white paper for SIL, infrastructure payments, planning obligations, and those various commuted sums that councils want off developers as part of a development. So if we then flick through to the next couple of slides. So firstly, what's new? What was new in 2019 at least? The 29 update did a number of things, about 10 or 11 different things, and some of them were quite minor. So we'll just gloss over those. But the First thing they've done is get rid of some of the unfair onerous penalties, particularly at the lower level. So this doesn't necessarily apply on the big development scale, but working on self-build residential annexes, you might remember the Shropshire case where Mr. Jones told Shropshire Council what he was doing, but he told them by email to the planning team. He didn't tell them on the correct form to the SIL team, and ended up going all the way to the High Court, and that the council's 45 grand charge was upheld. If that had happened now, for a post 1st of September 2019 permission, he would have got a slap on the wrist. He would have got a £2,500 fine rather than having the entire SIL charge laid against him. If you don't comply, as he technically didn't, you would still lose instalment policies, and there are still a few things that haven't necessarily been tidied up, but that is the SIL regs. They are to be viewed as a tax at times, not necessarily a charge in equity. Smoothing between phases has been smoothed out. This is particularly relevant if you're dealing with high density development in numbers of phases where you need to change densities between your phases and you're going back to replan things. So there's a smoothing charge has been added in there and dealt with better. Local authorities are now required to republish their indexation charges, make them public rather than having to pay behind the scenes to get hold of the BCIS index. And since we looked at this, the full SIL index has now been published. So there is now a publicly available SIL index. So you might find the difficulty now is that you have to find the old index and apply the new SIL index, which is public. But the further this goes through, the more you will have one single SIL index that's publicly available. The big news on this slide is clearly that Reg 123 has been abolished. And who'd have thought a year on that that wouldn't be the rule of 6 we were talking about? So you may remember the planning rule of 6 for planning obligations, whereby no piece of infrastructure or no more than 5 pieces of infrastructure shall contribute from a 106 agreement. So if you had a properly planned allocated site in the local plan that needed a mitigation payments making for the local school, say, but that local school had already received 5 payments through 106 agreements, then it didn't matter what your local plan allocation was, you were going to struggle to mitigate the impact of it regardless. And Reg 123 was getting in the way, not just of developers forcing through some developments, but it was getting in the way of properly planned local council development. So there was objection on both sides of the fence to that, and it was quite right that the rule of 6 was gotten rid of. What the government has done is not just get rid of the sub-paragraph where the rule of 6 was, but they've got rid of the whole of Regulation 123. And later paragraphs in Reg 123 dealt with what has been referred to for the last 8, 9, 10 years as the rule against double dipping, whereby you cannot charge SIL and Section 106 for the same infrastructure. Well, since last September, you can. Now, I haven't seen many practical examples. It's possibly been the wrong year for councils taking the hard line on double charging, but they have been lawfully able to double charge for infrastructure for the last year or so. One of the reasons for that may simply be that Reg 122 that applied the statutory test, those tests that used to be in the circular, reasonable, necessary, directly related, in the same way. And some councils still have their Reg 123 lists on the website, and the two things together don't necessarily allow too many extra charges, but it is express in the guidance note and in the consultation response that came out at the time that this was intended to allow councils to double charge where appropriate. Lastly then, some of us might remember the Oxfordshire case from 2015 that really put monitoring fees in the spotlight. In some authorities, these can number tens of thousands of pounds for the cost of the council monitoring the implementation of the 106 agreement. Oxfordshire said they generally weren't lawful, with some minor exceptions. The SIL regs has made them lawful. So that debate we now have had with councils as to when they could be lawful is now out the window. The SIL regs for the last year or so have made them lawful. Moving quickly on. This is our top 5 hints and tips, things to do with SIL, things to watch out for. Like I said, it's extracted from a much more exciting top 10, but at times that much more exciting top 10 can be a little bit lawyerly. It can look at the process of buying and selling a site, the kind of evidence you might need to pass between people. These, I think, are a slightly more practical, real ground level sort of sets of the things you need to be looking for. Firstly, we've put it in separately as a hint number 0. Is there a charging schedule in place? It's important to remember that SIL is a compulsory charge once it's adopted by the council, but it is not compulsory for a council to adopt it. So you will see a range of SIL statuses around the country. Probably about 60% of local authorities have some form of SIL coming into place or already adopted, but there are a good quarter to a third that have little intention clearly of ever adopting it. And therefore you don't need to concern yourself with this lot. Implementation. This is something that catches a lot of people out. A lot of developers particularly are used to seeing Section 106 agreements that have a carve out. You recite the Town and Country Planning Act definition, and then you carve out things like site fencing, first footings, drainage, site security, lighting, those kind of things are all carved out in a 106. They are not carved out at the definition of implementation for SIL. Generally speaking, SIL is paid within 60 days of commencement. On larger sites, that instalment policy could be adopted and give you longer periods, but they all tie to implementation, and that implementation is the basic Town and Country Planning Act definition of implementation. Very, very, very basic works on site will implement a permission for the purposes of SIL, even if those works are carved out of the 106 agreement. So one of the practical concerns we often talk to clients here about is really having control over your contractors and knowing what's going to happen on site, when it's going to happen. Phasing. Phasing is probably our top way of dealing with the issues with implementation. If nearly anything can implement a site, and practically speaking, the first few months of works on site are site clearance, demolition, leveling, scraping, the kind of things that make a nice flat site where housing can then start to be developed on it. You don't, for cash flow reasons, you clearly don't want to be paying a good chunk of SIL charge within 60 days of starting to scrape a site and not really doing anything profitable yet. If you phase it, and you phase it in its simplest form by having a phase 0, which is infrastructure works, and a phase 1, which is 30 or 40 houses, and this is just, for instance, on a smaller site, you can delay quite substantially the payment of those of your SIL charge. It doesn't start to need to be paid until you actually start on the parcels of land where the houses are going to be built, and you carve out very specifically the works of infrastructure works at the outset and the works of real development work later on. Retrospective consents, they are a seriously bad idea. The commencement notice, as you'll have seen by the references earlier to Shropshire, is what starts the payment process. If you don't serve a commencement notice before you commence on site, all of the SIL payment is due up front. Now, if you're making a retrospective permission, it's nigh on impossible to serve a commencement notice before you've started, because you have nothing to lawfully commence at the point when you've already done the works. If there is a way around that through a 96A, through a section 73, through any other way of amending a consent that may not just have been not implemented perfectly to get you into the retrospective regime, then that would be preferred. There are smoothing payments, there are formula in the regs to deal with 96A and section 73. If it's retrospective, you have immediately commenced and you are paying that charge pretty quickly. Proof and evidence, this applies both ways around. This applies to a residential or a sort of transaction. If you're buying land that has already got a planning permission, that's already got some of the SIL details dealt with, you need good evidence. If you're giving your notices to the council, don't just put a hard copy in an envelope with a compliment slip. You need some way of recording how that information gets to the council. I did have a client get caught out exactly by this who had no proof that he'd sent his commencement notice in time. And that was, without proof, the council had to assume that he hadn't and they hadn't received it. And he's on the hook for paying the interest and for paying the penalty charges. If these forms can be submitted electronically with a read receipt, that is probably going to be your easiest practical way of having evidence throughout. Time calculations. Remember that these are always calculated backwards from the date of commencement. If you have a phased site, you're going to commence each phase at a different point in time. So we're talking here about the exemptions for demolished buildings, for reused floor space, that kind of thing. So this is where you need to put your lawyers, your guys dealing with evictions on the ground in touch with your planners and your planning lawyers who are dealing with your SIL strategy. You don't need to clear the whole site if you have a phased site, or if you do, for health and safety purposes and other things, you need to draw that together so that your 3-year countback periods are all valid and keep you within those exemptions, or else there's no point planning for those reused exemptions and the quite considerable savings that can make you in places. Hopefully those are helpful. I want to just move on then to some of the COVID implications, which we'll briefly skim over. So next slide. So the problem hit earlier this year, and I'm sure there's plenty of people on this call with real practical examples of this, where March, April hits and sites have to be closed for the health and safety reasons relating to the potential with the COVID and the coronavirus. Some of those sites had already had a planning permission implemented on them, and therefore SIL was running. SIL is payable, like the slide says, 60 days from commencement on smaller sites, or if a larger site and an instalment policy has been adopted, you may have longer periods of time, but all of those periods of time are measured from the date on which you commenced. As opposed to a Section 106 agreement, say, where there is elements of discretion on the council, and most of those are reasonably cleverly worded to apply to dates when the developer's actually receiving some cash flow from the site, usually occupations, that kind of thing. So you start to make payments to the council once you've received some money from people occupying those houses. It all makes a bit of sense until the whole thing stalls. And some of us may have looked at this with experience of the last recession when mothballed sites were needed to be sort of rolled up. Industry was crawling around a bit in sort of 08, 09. 08, 09, there wasn't SIL. So a site could be implemented and then mothballed without the same concerns about the payments which still have to be made. And in some sites, in some areas, particularly London and the South, the SIL payments can be into the millions. At that point, you're really struggling from having had to mothball the site. Our advice on this, as it was, and this has changed slightly with the next slide that I'll introduce to you, is that councils had no discretion to vary payment terms under the SIL regulations. Once you've implemented a development, you are tied to the instalment policy that's in place at the time. So even if a local authority had sympathy for the developers working in their area and changed their instalment policy, let's say the 60 days there suddenly became 360 in a council's area. Well, if you've already implemented your development, you can't benefit from that. Councils have wide discretion over use of enforcement powers apart from late payment interest. So they could agree not to go after developers for a variety of these things because they could see what was happening come March, April, but they still had a statutory duty to apply interest to them. Adopting new reliefs and that kind of thing. So a lot of the reliefs in the SIL process are optional for a council to adopt through its process, could only apply if that consent hasn't yet been implemented. There was one technical point we started to discuss, which is the idea of withdrawing and reissuing liability and demand notices at a council's discretion, but still very much a grey area. And it still meant that you had to be very careful about what I've just mentioned previously about the time periods for exemptions and those kind of uses. So whilst we welcomed pragmatism, a lot of that pragmatism we were hearing from local authorities wasn't legally enforceable. Cue the next slide, which is Robert Jenrick's announcement that came into force in July 2021, came into force July 2020 and is only valid for a year until July 2021. And it allowed local authorities to grant 6-month deferrals for SIL to small and medium-sized developers, and they categorised that at anything less than a £45 million turnover. You had to show that that developer was suffering as a result of coronavirus and COVID, Some of our specialist clients, care and student providers, that kind of thing, showing that they were suffering was quite easy. Showing that precise from broad brush at anything, it will depend on the local authority, the evidence they want, and that kind of thing. And what it did is it pretty much waived interest, which was the main thing that councils didn't have any discretion over. Coupled this with the deferral of the planning permission commencement dates, and the government was at least trying to work to get those matters deferred. I am slowly running out of time. I'll look to others for a nod, but we'll move on quickly. The next 3 or 4 slides are pretty self-explanatory, so they'll come to you in the notes afterwards. I'm just going to highlight a couple of points. This is the change. The white paper recommends getting rid of community infrastructure levy completely and replacing it with another thing called consolidated infrastructure levy, so that the acronyms at least will stay exactly the same. They will also recommend getting rid of planning obligations for commuted sums. So 106 agreements will stay, but only for restrictive covenants on land and things that you need to, don't do the development until you've done a local skills session, that kind of thing. So the new charge will operate as a fixed proportion of development value above a certain threshold with mandatory nationally set rates. Now, I already have a problem with this because rates set locally vary already across a region or a district. So I really have trouble with rates being set nationally and applied at will to a region or a district, because those districts have differences within them that are hard to deal with in this. I'm going to skip on from that slide quite quickly. It is self-explanatory and I want to give others the chance to talk as well. Affordable housing will apparently be dealt with under the levy and have a way of offsetting. So if you can deliver certain levels of affordable housing, you may find a way of offsetting the entire charge. This will clearly help registered providers and those kind of developers that deliver 100% affordable housing schemes on site. How it works for those that are delivering policy minimum and that kind of thing is yet to be seen, but it's the idea is a form of risk sharing. Moving on. How it's to be spent, they've upped the share that goes to the local body, the parish council. 25% to parish councils. At the moment, that's 15% unless you have a neighbourhood plan in place. With a ring-fence proportion kept for affordable housing. Again, like I said, these slides are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to skip through them fairly fast. If we go to the next one. Like I said, 106 agreements are still required for non-financial obligations, such as the care provision in retirement villages, employment and training initiatives, management and maintenance obligations. But they are all of the financial obligations, the commuted sums, are supposed to then be paid for through the overall charge. So in theory, it makes it simpler and easier to calculate your charge up front. So developers looking at what's it going to cost and how do I bid on that site should, in theory, have a clearer system, but the devil is in the detail as always. Moving on. Yeah, so viability then becomes the missing piece of this puzzle. All viability concerns are supposed to be dealt with by a nil rate band. How that works when that is set nationally, I think we are yet to see. And there is some detail here that we are still clearly waiting to catch up with. And again, they say here at the end, we will also consider the impact of this change in areas with lower land values. So it is unclear how a nationally set charge can deal with viability on a local level. And it's certainly a flag to what I'm seeing. Next slide. Yep, so there's a summary here just of where we think the questions are, what the risks, rewards, concerns are. How and where will these charging rates be set? It appears to be nationally at the moment. How and where will the nil rate band or viability threshold be set? Again, nationally may be a problem. Does the set nationally collect and spend locally formula worse than the north-south divide? By putting in a north divide or a north-south divide, what about the Midlands? That always seems to be something that's forgotten about when we talk about north-south politics. There is a big area of land in the middle. Will there need to be redistribution between geographic areas? Probably. How does this factor into upcoming local authority reforms? How does prepayment occupation or payment pre-occupation work? What about instalment policies? So if you've given land in advance, what about these triggers? And how can we ensure timely delivery of infrastructure without ring fencing of funds, which has always been the big problem with SIL. Newark, with a famous example, one of the very first authorities outside of London to get a SIL charge in place, but 6-7 years on had not delivered any infrastructure with those funds they were receiving. Next slide. I think that's, yeah, so we've got a question slide. We've got a team slide. When these come around, you'll have the details if you want to pop any questions through to us. Otherwise, I'm passing on to Rhys or Alex. Apologies for the fast whip through, but I think I was running out of time towards the end there.
Thank you, Stuart. I think, yes, we'll leave the questions to the end. If we have time, we can always send them round, but I'll swiftly move on to Peter now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. Thank you, Rhys. Good morning, all. Now, my presentation is going to provide some reflections on the proposed changes to the planning system and the process by which those changes may come about. So what I'm not going to do is to undertake some form of extensive exegesis of the terms of the proposed reforms. Firstly, those reforms are largely well known and I think generally appreciated. Secondly, I think we must be cautiously realistic on what we think is actually likely to appear both in the legislation and in the policy. Now, by its nature, planning is intensely political. Now, by that I mean just about everyone has a view upon it and the problems that it throws up. Further, politicians of all stripes, persuasions, and varieties, they all have at least one or perhaps more than one view about what should happen to the system, the local plan, controversial planning decisions, and decisions about matters which at first blush did not seem controversial. Now, it's perhaps because of its importance that the planning system is seen as a key driver, and for that matter, brake upon the general economy, that every government since the inception of the current system in 1947 has sought to amend, tinker with, consolidate, further amend the legislative and policy components of the system. Now, for those of you with an enhanced interest in the process to date, if you have the odd hour or 10, then I'd recommend you have a look at the index and tables volume, yes, volume, of the Planning Encyclopedia, because that will, at least in summary form, through running through the several hundred pages of that particular volume, provide a fitting skeleton to understand the near perpetual process of change which has permeated the planning process over so many decades. However, the underlying principle of seeking to make land use decisions, planning in the public interest, remains throughout. What is perhaps less evident is a clear concept of what the public interest continues to be and what objectives are intended to be served. Now, part of the difficulty is the original conception of our planning system was to provide for a more centralized, government-directed undertaking of development that would be planned, perhaps a tad Soviet style, and then carried out in successive 5-year periods. In short, it was prospective, and the clue is in the word planning. What's occurred has perhaps been rather different to that original concept. The vast bulk of development is private sector generated, derived from private investment, and where the system is one more directed to development control. Now, a component of the system has always been forward planning, but that was given added force by the Planning and Compensation Act in 1991, which provided for the statutory reinforcement of the plan-led system with the introduction of what was then Section 54A, and now Section 38(6) under the 2004 Act for that principle. Yet, so many plans take years to develop, and by the time they're eventually adopted, they no longer reflect the economic, social, or even environmental circumstances which are most pressing to deal with. Now, perhaps the most pressing concern for the government, and indeed successive governments, has been the failure of the planning system to deliver anywhere near enough housing in order to meet the current and future needs of its population. The last time the country met the annual need for its housing for its population was in 1968. It has been the subject of successive reviews and reports. Who, for instance, remembers Kate Barker, none of which has given rise to the necessary scale of increase in housing provision. Not only does that fail to meet housing needs of the population, it has also created and creates recurrent cyclical economic problems, including from time to time rampant inflation and economic dislocation of resources, relating not only to construction but also other industries. So it's against that background that the present government has made its radical proposals to seek to increase housing numbers to perhaps 337,000 dwellings per annum by the mid-2020s, and a radical change to the development plan system with the identification of growth areas that are deemed suitable for substantial development, renewal areas which are deemed suitable for development, and protected areas which by implication would not be considered suitable for development and or subject to more stringent development controls. Now, interestingly, despite the desire to increase housing numbers, the government is explicitly considering scrapping the 5-year housing land supply requirement, ostensibly on the basis that in this brave new world, it would no longer be necessary. Now, experience of most planning professionals would suggest that the requirement is one of the few that continues to provide pressure on at least some authorities to ensure that land for housing continues to emerge. That said, government policy since 2012 has in effect removed that requirement from any authorities substantially affected by Greenbelt designation within their authority areas. The consultation proposals also seek to provide for a statutory timetable of no more than 30 months for plan preparation, with sanctions for those who fail to do so. Now, that would appear at the very least surprising that that time period would be adhered to. As we know, some authorities, including in the Midlands, have indeed been so discombobulated by the white paper reforms that they have paused their local plans. One might think so much for plan-led system. Now, there are a plethora of other proposed changes, including the acceleration in the process for the determination of planning applications, with shorter and more standardised application forms, and with an anticipation that there would be many fewer planning appeals. Again, experience would suggest that that may be a surprising result. So what are we to make of these proposed changes? At face value, they may be described as brave or even courageous. Now, I'll look at decoding those terms a little later. Whatever be the case, those likely to be impacted in a way that in which they would dislike will perhaps be less enamoured by the reforms. As I said earlier, the planning system and any proposals for change is highly political. And to that extent, I would respectfully suggest that it is necessary to approach the prospect of the current proposed changes with a very substantial degree of caution. Many local authorities, particularly those in the south and southeast of England, have reacted with undisguised horror at the prospect of having to accommodate substantially more development, especially for housing in their local authority areas, if the current proposals were to come to fruition. A number of commentators and consultancies, including DLP, have analysed the consequences, both numerically and geographically, if the government's present changes took place. I know Alex is going to deal with this shortly. Recognition of those consequences has led to wide-scale political controversy at local authority level and consequential controversy at parliamentary level. If widely circulated briefings are to be believed, there is a WhatsApp group of at least 100 Tory MPs opposed to the government's reform, and in particular, its proposed new algorithm for the assessment and distribution of housing requirements. And I'll come back to that again briefly shortly. But remaining with the political scene, it must be borne in mind that each MP is critically dependent upon local politicians for support, and vice versa. It's perhaps for that reason that the Minister for Housing has described the various consultant analyses as speculation. Pardon me. It's necessary to decode political language. It should be noted that what's been said is not that the numerical analyses are wrong or even somewhat flawed, but speculation. I'll leave you to work out what you think that term might mean. However, the lifeblood of local politics, which inevitably flows into national politics, is the ability of local politicians to stand for election on the basis of developments they have championed and, much more often, the developments they have opposed. To my mind, it would seem improbable in the extreme that there will be adequate parliamentary support for the range and depth of changes suggested in the White Paper. Certainly, any parliamentary process to progress any bill seeking to implement proposals closely akin to the White Paper will be difficult, protracted, and painful for the government. As we know, the consultation process on the various proposed changes, which ended last month, will take a number of months to conclude. It'll be interesting to see, not only in the light of those representations, but the various parliamentary discussions, what proposals will actually come forward. However, does that mean I'm suggesting there will be no new planning bill? No. However, I would be extremely cautious in saying that any future planning act is likely to comprise the ostensibly radical components in the White Paper. My suspicion is the government will say, we have listened and produced a more nuanced and, if anything, rather more evolutionary set of proposals than have been tabled to date. I said I'd say a little more about the algorithm, and that's the revised standard method for ascertaining housing requirements. Almost everyone is aware of the difficulties of seeking to utilise the earlier formulation based upon household projections, as these were the consequence of consistent chronic under-provision of housing. That was the difficulty of using the 2016 household projections and the return to the use of the 2014 projections following the initial publication of the 2018 NPPF together with the PPG. However, any process does involve seeking to use a formula. It has previously, it does now, and is so proposed in future. In one sense, the term algorithm might be considered at the very least as partially apt. The reason why it's now toxic is because it was the term used to describe the mechanistic and highly suspect approach adopted for the purposes of grading GCSE and A-level qualifications last summer. It is now a term of outright opprobrium. It is perhaps of little surprise that it is now consistently used to describe the proposed standard method relating to housing. I've mentioned the need to decode political language. Those old enough to remember it may recall the political sitcom of yesteryear, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. The civil servants would describe certain political proposals as brave, very brave, or courageous. It was explained that brave meant that a proposal would mean losing votes. A courageous decision would lose you an election. I would invite you to consider whether the government, having regard to its current challenges, will elect to be brave or even courageous with regard to planning reform. Indeed, if recent reports are to be believed, changes in the makeup of certain of the unelected components of the government machine are being made with a view to producing a kinder and more listening administration, one that is more in contact with the objectives of its backbenchers and grassroots. Now, I would not suggest that anything is off the table just as yet, but I would suggest that there is likely to be more evolutionary rather than revolutionary proposals that will transpire, irrespective of the language used. Lord Carnwath, a distinguished planning lawyer and now former Supreme Court judge, took the time to pen his own representations to the Secretary of State on the proposed Planning for the Future White Paper. His three-word description of the present system would be robust, but over-cluttered and under-resourced. His thesis was that the aim should be to build on the strengths of the existing system, reduce the clutter, and ensure adequate resources in terms of finance and personnel, and above all, to provide a period of political stability to allow the planning system to settle down and gain public understanding and confidence. That seems reasonable to me. Thank you very much. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Just getting my microphone unmuted there. Could you answer the next slides, please, Rhys? Thanks very much. Today, or this morning, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to have a quick run through of where we are with plan making in the West Midlands. As you can see on that slide there, a very quick look at how the attempt at strategic planning in the West Midlands fared, and then having a quick look at three of the points that Peter mentioned this morning, and that's primarily the streamlining of the process, calculating housing need, and how strategic planning might work in this brave/courageous new world that we're soon to venture into, and then what those possible implications might mean for plan making, strategic planning in the West Midlands. So just sticking with the slide that we're on for now, and you can see that everyone has a plan. They're all in place, but the question is whether they're up to date. Who knows? Some of them are a number of years old. I think the oldest one on there, up there in Stoke-on-Trent, Newcastle, and then we've also got Wyre Forest. They're approaching 10, 11 years old, but they are on the way with making new plans. Some of those plans are still in examination, such as North Warwickshire, almost 2 years there. Stratford upon Avon are embarking on their new plan in the new year. Telford and Wrekin have just gone out with an issues and options consultation, and Bromsgrove are one of those local authorities that have said that they're going to wait and see what the white paper will say to them. It'll be interesting to see if Warwick, East Staffordshire, Rugby, Coventry and Birmingham also fall into that same category as Bromsgrove, and whether any of the other ones which are currently progressing their local plans will pause and then wait to see what happens with the white paper. If you go on to the next slide, please, Rhys. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I used to work in the West Midlands. I used to be the planning manager at Tamworth Borough Council, so I was quite heavily involved in strategic planning back then, and was involved in the GBS spatial plan for growth. There have been a few successes and a few in the West Midlands for strategic planning in recent years. You've got Coventry in the west of Warwickshire. You've got Lichfield, excuse me, Cannock Chase, Tamworth and North Warwickshire coming together to try to meet housing needs there. You've got the South Worcestershire authorities doing a joint plan together. Redditch and Bromsgrove helping each other out. Black Country authorities, again, doing a combined core strategy. Stoke and Newcastle working quite closely together. So that's some degree of success. And most of those arrangements were based on the old RSS system. So those were in place and they were continuing those arrangements which were still there. However, the big question that's still left unanswered is the unmet housing needs arising from Birmingham. Those of you may have been involved in that development plan examination will remember TP48, that policy, and the very interesting examination sessions we had on that one. There was a good idea to try and resolve that through plan making, a spatial plan for growth through the GBS LEP. However, as Peter's alluded to, planning can very often be political, and the way forward through that spatial plan for growth never materialised. No one really wanted to take forward Birmingham's housing growth with any gusto, let's say, and it's been dragged out over many years, and those just under 38,000 homes have really failed to be materialised in anyone else's development plans. So that has been quite a big problem, and it'll be interesting to see, as I'll come into slides later on, how how that could be resolved through the new planning system. If you just go into the next slide, please. So some of those implications we're going to look at are looking at the streamlining of the process, how you can do it quicker, what does it mean about the way you calculate housing needs, and that algorithm Peter was talking about then. It's interesting to see that how you would go about calculating employment land needs, economic growth, is completely devoid in the white paper. I think it's always makes me smile that whenever we talk about how planning and strategic planning, employment land is always left off that list, but that's I consider that to be equally important, really, understanding how places grow. And I think it's part and parcel of that economic growth. It's not just always about housing and where that should go. In the West Midlands, there's always been a need to understand where different sectors of the economy can be located, for example, where logistics should be located across the region. And that's something I think should always be taken forward. And it's disappointing to see that wasn't included in the white paper. And then finally, looking at how that might impact on plan making in the West Midlands, what sort of plan might we get at the end of it? So we go on to the next slide. This is just looking at how the process might be speeded up. Now, government want to regulate this process, it seems, through legislation, and it would give us a 30-month time frame from start to finish for the preparation and completion of plans. There's a few questions I have on that process. What about the evidence? How can you prepare evidence bases in effectively a 12 or 12 plus 6 month period? What do you do about strategic planning in that process? There's no idea of how you might have those conversations within that 12-month period. In my experience, and as we can see in the West Midlands, that has taken a lot longer than 12 months and is still ongoing in some cases. And then things like examinations in 9 months. I mean, I just highlighted the example there of North Warwickshire, or involved in other local plans across the country, in particular in Hertfordshire, where they have a good history of taking a very long time to progress plans through examination. Even the finalisation of an adoption of plans isn't always guaranteed. There's plenty of examples recently of plans failing to be adopted by members. For example, in Amber Valley, in Derbyshire, the members decided not to adopt the plan, go forward with adopting a plan, and again in Ashfield district as well. So these time frames, whilst it would be great if local plans could be prepared in such a quick time frame, I think that is going to be unlikely. There's inevitably things that will get in the way, and I think speed shouldn't always be paramount in this. I think having a good plan in place is the key thing. Go on to the next slide, please, Rhys. Thanks. Peter just brought us into the new approach to standard method. As we can see on the left-hand side of the screens, we've got the existing approach. It's 3 steps, which is to look at your household increases over a 10-year period, apply affordability uplift, and then cap that to 40% on any increase. The proposed system, and there's just to bear in mind, there are 2 new proposals. The first proposal is to change the way you calculate housing need in the current system, and the proposal I'm looking at now is going to be the proposed system for new development plans. And that's essentially 3 steps again, but the third one is very different from the current 3rd step. So again, the starting point is looking at household changes over a 10-year period, or what the increase of existing stock would be, which one's the higher. The second step is to apply that uplift. Again, that's based on house prices and wages. And then the 3rd step is very unclear at the moment what that might actually be, and that, as we've seen from the white paper, that is some sort of backroom function perhaps of MHCLG, where they will reduce people's housing requirements based on constraints. We'll go on to the next slide, please, Rhys. So having a look at how this impacts across the whole country, we can see that the West Midlands has the 3rd highest increase across England. The highest one obviously there is in the West Midlands, increasing by 44%. The next is in the Southwest, increased by 34%, and then West Midlands 26%. Everywhere else does have increases, and we see an increase in total across England of just over 20%. So some big changes coming forward with the revised method, and you can see how that gets you to the magic figure of above 300,000. You got to 33,000 there using that revised standard method. But it'd be interesting to see the third step, what that would do to achieving 300,000 a year. So go on to the next slide, please, Rhys. This shows you how that regional picture is made up of all the different local authorities in the West Midlands. So we can see some places where there's going to be big increases. So we've got Stratford-upon-Avon and Wychavon having increases of over 180%. And we've got Birmingham, which has got a significant decrease of just under 40%. The reasons for this, if you analyse the step 1, step 2, it shows that probably because the Stratford-upon-Avon has been building a lot more houses recently and has seen high increases of people moving into the area. That's one explanation for the significant increase in the revised standard methodology. And again, for Birmingham, one of the reasons why it's lower is because we've seen a lot of people moving away. And that is really to be expected because it cannot meet its own housing needs. So that's something that's inevitable for places like Birmingham. That's always going to go down. But the question is, where do those people go, and do they always manage to go to the places where they can still have their housing needs met within that housing market area? So are they able to go to places like Stratford-upon-Avon, North Warwickshire, Tamworth, Lichfield, Cannock, maybe places in the Black Country, maybe places in North Worcestershire? And it looks like from those figures it is happening like that. So we just map those figures out for you on this map, and that shows you really how the big increases are around the centre, around Birmingham, and then again around the bigger conurbation areas of the Black Country, and also around Coventry. And it's the shire areas, as you'd expect, with lower housing needs, apart from Stratford-upon-Avon, which has had a significant amount increase, and that will be from housing needs from Coventry moving over, and also Birmingham. If you go into the next slide, please, Rhys. This is the third step. So one of the biggest implications for the third step in the West Midlands is likely to be Greenbelt. Now, government haven't actually made it quite clear in the standard method through the standard methodology proposals and in the white paper what these constraints would be that they would apply in effectively the third step. Now, if we look at what this might mean with Greenbelt, we can see that there are, as we all know, big areas of Greenbelt in the West Midlands. How will that impact on housing requirements in the West Midlands? Will it drop that down significantly? Will a sympathetic ear be lent to the shire counties? So, for example, North Warwickshire, Lichfield, Cannock, Stafford, Worcestershire, will government decrease those housing requirements because they have got Greenbelt in there? Will the housing requirement in Birmingham and Coventry be decreased because there aren't the spaces available to build new houses? So the effects of the new standard methodology are still quite unclear for the West Midlands. We know that effectively the starting point for those discussions that might happen in government, but where will it end up at? We just don't know at the moment. If you go on to the next slide, please, Rhys. If you go on to the next one, I'll come back to this one in a second. So the third point I was going to look at was, what about the duty to cooperate? Are we having a return to an RSS light? So as we all remember, the MPPF effectively abolished regional spatial strategies. It removed that top-down approach, and the then Conservative government wanted local authorities to determine their own future. They wanted to have to assess their own housing needs. Where local authorities couldn't do that, there was the ability to work with the neighbouring authorities, and I went through a few examples at the start there of how that's been successful in the West Midlands and also where it's failed. But I think on the whole, in a purely numbers sense, it's failed in the West Midlands. The duty to cooperate has failed to replace RSS. Strategic planning has failed to be able to meet housing needs in the West Midlands. Now, the white paper suggests what could come in place of that. And at page 32, it says, we'll also propose that it will be possible for authorities to agree an alternative distribution of their requirement in the context of joint planning arrangements. In particular, it may be appropriate for mayors of combined authorities to oversee the strategic distribution of the requirement in a way that alters the distribution of numbers, and this would be allowed for. There's two things from that. Firstly, we don't know what type of plans mayors could produce. Would it be a effectively strategic plan that they could do? And how would other plan making authorities, so individual local authorities, work together to prepare a joint plan? It might end up being that authorities actually don't end up with a housing need that they can't meet, because that's step 3 from government actually removes all that unmet housing need. Could government actually give that unmet housing need to someone else through that process? We don't know. So there's quite a lot of questions to be asked of the white paper and what it proposes to do with strategic planning. If you just go back a slide, please, Rhys. So just broadly thinking what these implications could be in the West Midlands. And I've just touched on some of those there. So just looking at the second main bullet point. So some of the problems that could arise in the West Midlands is that the West Midlands Combined Authority could potentially do a strategic distribution plan. However, not every single authority in the West Midlands is part of the Combined Authority. You've got issues such as Coventry being within that Combined Authority, but it's hinterland. The authorities of Warwickshire, so Rugby, and Nuneaton, Bedworth, North Warwickshire, Stratford, Warwick, they aren't in that Combined Authority. They might have some involvement in it, but they don't have the voting rights. So it'd be interesting to see what the implications would be if a strategic plan for the Combined Authority is prepared, and what impact that would have on the shire authorities around it. The same will go for areas in Staffordshire as well, and in Worcestershire, how they might have to deal with Birmingham's needs as well. If you go on to the next slide, and then the next one again. Thanks, Rhys. So if that system is put in place in the West Midlands, what could those implications be? And I've had to think about this. There's potentially two different scenarios. The first one I look at now is, I guess you could say, worst case, the bad case scenario, and the second one is how you could actually use this new system to actually achieve things that weren't being able to achieve before. So you could end up with housing requirements being lowered. You've got poor housing delivery, and because it's failing to support economic growth, which could have impacts on economic growth across the region. You could have worsening affordability across the region, so you're not actually being able to build enough houses where those houses are needed, which is creating increased pressure on demand for new homes. Development pressure could increase in certain locations, which could lead to unsustainable outcomes. And as I said at the outset, economic growth is given quite a light touch. There's no consideration of those on a strategic and regional level, and that could fall by the wayside. Strategic planning, spatial framework, they've never seemed to progress very well so far in the new system. And again, shire counties have not helped out on that process, and that's down to politics. So it could end up with a continuation of that worsening scenario of strategic planning in the West Midlands. We could end up with local plans being prepared in isolation and effectively have a patchwork of old and new plans across the region. So some plans that are coming forward now will be in the old system that we're still working through. Some will be in the new system. There's no real clear arrangements from government how different plans could transition to the old ones into new ones, and what those arrangements might be. How can you deal with those big strategic issues if you've got such a diverse way of making plan making to try and capture all those different problems? If you go on to the next one, please. So this is looking at how things could improve. So housing requirements could be kept at the levels that I've shown in step 2. And you could have, as I said, in the middle there, you could actually have a spatial distribution of housing needs across all the authorities. They can actually get to work together. Housing growth could support economic growth, and housing requirements could potentially increase. Affordability doesn't get worse, it might stay the same, but you may end up seeing more affordable homes getting delivered. Developments distributed where it's needed the highest and in sustainable locations. Economic growth could be planned for across the region. Local plans could be prepared in a comprehensive way, so perhaps a strategic plan comes first. Local plans would follow that, and you can pick up on all those strategic issues that need to be resolved through individual plans, such as allocating sites for development and where in particular things might go. If you go on to the next slide, please, Rhys. So just to summarise some of those points there, I think it's quite clear that plan making in the West Midlands has been difficult since the 2012 framework came in. There have been attempts by regional bodies, whether that's the LEP, maybe through the Combined Authority, to try and resolve those big issues that arise from Birmingham. And so far that's been quite unsuccessful. Where there have been historic ties through the RSS, those achievements have been made. So as I say, through, for example, with Tamworth, Cannock, Lichfield, the Black Country authorities, and also in Worcestershire as well, and Coventry and Warwickshire. So I think it'd be quite important to build on those relationships that they've already got there. Perhaps something like an RSS light would be the way forward to try and resolve those big issues going forward. I don't think the white paper covers employment growth particularly well, and I think it would be wise for that to be brought back into the fore for the next version of that white paper. And I think it should be something that the local authorities in the West Midlands do still to pick up. One of the things that I thought about when I was reading through the white paper as well, and it brings me back to my days at Birmingham University. And I think it's one of those things that you think that your lecturers say to you, but maybe they didn't. And it's something that probably might be, as Austin Barber said to me, something complex issues are difficult to resolve. And attempting to simplify them will not necessarily resolve the issue, and it could actually make things worse. So I think if it's difficult, it's probably difficult for a reason, and to resolve it properly is the best thing to do, rather than simplify it, trying to brush things under the carpet, because that doesn't actually resolve the problem that you're actually trying to deal with. So hopefully you found that interesting, and I'll hand back over to Rhys. I think we've got a few questions that have come in through the presentation, which we'll go through now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you to all three speakers for some really interesting and thought-provoking views there. I think what we'll do is we'll go to the questions raised in the Q&A box. We'll deal with them first, just because we are pushed for time. A question on SIL for Stuart from Justin. If affordable housing was dealt with as part of the levy, so outside of Section 106, how does this impact on the Homes England grant funding programme? At present, his understanding is that grant funding is only permitted on affordable provision over and above what is set in the 106.
Okay, there's a couple of points here. The first, I want to pick up on the second part of the question first, if I can. Homes England grant funding, the link to Section 106, that's exactly what the policy says, but it's not the intention of Homes England, and it's not the real practice. And this has been a real trick of over provision on a site through most of my years of practice. And if your developer is only able to provide the policy minimum or less, it's a bit irrelevant. The whole thing kicks in. They're doing that through a 106, and the policy does what it means to do. The meaning behind the policy is that whatever the council have set their policy minimum at, Homes England don't want to be funding into that anymore. Before about 2012, 2013, you may have got grant for some of those, but when it changed to this kind of wording, the whole point is that the policy minimum in the local plan is not for Homes England to be funding. Where that gets complicated is if, for whatever reason, and I've seen this done to deal with benefits of flood risk areas and that kind of thing, or even just fully 100% sites promoted by a registered provider, how do you secure that? The first hit is for the local authority to go to a 106 to secure a 100% site or whatever. a bit extra to compensate flood risk, something like that. And for a few years, we were having to take those commitments out of a 106 agreement and put them in some other form of contract so that they're still secured. But because it's over and above a 106 agreement, it doesn't have to be declared in the same way to Homes England. My understanding is that whilst it still has the same question on that box, in the last 2 or 3 years, they have interrogated it a little bit more intelligently. And if you were to tick the box and say, policy minimum's 20%, actually I'm providing 30%, so I'm applying for grant funding for the additional 10%, they would still entertain that. Whether or not you get grant funding is then down to other issues and what other things are coming through the programme at the time. The second part of the question coming first then is possibly because I've rushed through this a little bit trying to finish my slides and hand over. It's not necessarily that affordable housing is going to be dealt with as part of the levy. First and foremost, the proposal looks like, and a lot of this is down to it being a proposal, not having the detail there yet, but it looks like, for my mind, the full national levy is set at a certain level that doesn't know if affordable housing is going to be on site or not. You then provide some on-site affordable housing and you offset against that total amount. So let's say your national levy calculates your £1 million levy. You then provide 2 on-site affordable houses, put a nominal value of 50k for each, and now you're paying 900k. Works in that kind of fashion, to the extent that if you provide enough affordable housing on site, you could reduce your overall payment to nothing. What that doesn't do is tell us how you secure the on-site affordable housing. And there is an oddity in the wording, and it says here, it's offsetting whereby the discount at which affordable housing is sold is used as an offset against the final liability under the infrastructure levy. Now, I don't know if that is the policy writers assuming that all affordable housing is sold, which it clearly isn't, or if they're actually looking at the sales value from a developer to a registered provider, which clearly is a very different kind of receipt. So I think there's a lot more devil in the detail to run through that. The other end to that is that the levy can be used by local authorities to provide affordable housing, which SIL cannot. The one thing expressly carved out when we were writing Reg 123 lists is that you can't be putting affordable housing on it. You can't be seeking to include in your SIL tariff provision of affordable housing. That remained in 106, whereas you may have restrictive covenants on land for how affordable housing is dealt with, but the value is intended to be included in SIL because in the new levy, whereas when we've had SIL and at least affordable housing running on twin tracks, it's meant that the values of those two things are very difficult to correlate together. Does all that make sense?
Thank you, Stuart. Just while we're on SIL, not so much of a question, but a comment from DLP's Neil Osborne on double dipping. Just that East Suffolk are expressly expecting to double dip on education on a scheme in Beccles. So
I have quickly pulled up their website while I saw that question come in. They have there's a lot of authorities out there who still display their Reg 123 lists. East Suffolk have already taken theirs down, which may say it all. But they do have the draft Reg 123 list up from when it was consulted on. Interestingly, they have about 4 or 5 entries for education, and not one of those is provision of new schools and new sites. So it may well be that they never intended that to be in SIL originally. So I'm interested to know whether they're expressly, like Neil says, expressly saying they're going to double dip, or whether they would have always done something like this. So there's provision in their old SIL Reg 123 draft for new school places, but they separately understand the issue of providing new school sites because they specifically carve out one large development at Adastral Park and talk about primary and secondary school provision, as opposed to provision of new school places at primary and secondary schools. It might just be I'm being a bit too loyally with the wording of their old schedule that's now been taken off the website in any event, but interesting one to look at.
okay, finally, This looks like it could be one for Alex. Alex Anderson. Hi, are there any LPA areas that are likely to be more willing to trim back their green belt than others for new housing sites? Will some feel greater pressures than others?
Thanks, Rhys. There's quite a few local authority areas that have done green belt release, or at least proposing to do it. So you've got Lichfield, Solihull, Coventry, Birmingham, Bromsgrove, Stratford. And they are, some of them are trimming, so there's little chunks here and there, and some of them are making quite bigger green belt releases, such as Birmingham, parts of Coventry. But I think what's probably needed is much larger green belt release, whether that's some quite substantial big urban extensions throughout the conurbation area, or whether it's potentially new settlements here and there. Who knows? From my discussions and my understanding of what's happened in the past and where people arrive at is, we'll release some of our green belt, you release some of your green belt. So it's almost like if we're going to do it, we're going to do it together. And they don't like to see green belt. And I think it was either the leader now of Lichfield District Council or the old leader of Lichfield District Council said that he wasn't going to release green belt to meet Birmingham people. So you've got problems like that when it comes to green belt release. And I think having a joined up plan will allow for those sorts of discussions to happen through evidence-based discussions, and hopefully it would allow for a sensible approach to green belt release. But going back to what I said earlier, the white paper is quite devoid of anything about green belt. So my expectation is that green belt release will still be as difficult as it is now to come about, and you will be reliant on the local authority to do that. And if they don't want to do it, they don't want to do it. And I think government will not force local authorities to do that in any event. It'll be their own decision and something that they will decide is a good idea to do. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Alex. So we are over time now. Just before we finish up, do the panel have any questions to each other? Just conscious of time, but we've got a couple of minutes maybe.
I think I've got one for Stuart, if that's all right. The new infrastructure levy that's coming forward, how do you think local authorities will decide to spend the money that they get on what? I mean, they could spend it on anything from park benches to hanging baskets. Who knows what they might spend it on? But will they necessarily spend it on the things that they need, whether that's the new roads or new schools, GP surgeries, whatever? What do you think is needed to make sure that they do spend the money in the right places? That could be a whole examination.
It could be a whole seminar in itself, couldn't it? That's what they're going to spend it on, I think, really is down to local politics. As I've worked in across a shared service and down south, probably 7 or 8 local authorities in-house, and clearly in the private sector now, have seen exposure to a lot more. The one constant in all of this, no matter which side of the fence you are, is a concern about affordable housing. When you break down into political parties and discuss it, the concern becomes nuanced as to how you solve the problem, whether you're getting people onto the housing ladder and buying their own homes, or whether you're solving the problem of how affordable rent is in this country. But all political parties and all sort of ends of it seem to be concerned about simply that, affordability of housing. So that they can now spend the new levy on solving that themselves, that some of the authorities I've worked with and seen acting recently have started to bring back some forms of council housing by way of their own owned housing companies and that kind of thing. I suspect a good chunk of the money would go towards that, but the rest of it then becomes, what are the local political concerns? Payments into the NHS, surgery provision, that kind of thing seems to be taking a growing trend. And then it possibly falls down to simply how well publicised this is. SIL receipts at the moment, 15% of that goes back to your parish council, 25% for those with a neighbourhood plan. But how many of them really truly get their hands on the money that's in their area and do something big for their parish or village with it? I think a lot of that is about educating that those at the sort of lower levels beneath the district council in terms of planning and local politic.
Okay. Is that about it? I can see that people are slowly filing out the virtual door at the back. So just like to thank everybody again. Stuart, really interesting whiz through SIL, making SIL sexy. Peter, thank you for your insights into the post consultation period, and Alex for drilling down into the detail. And as I said previously, we'll be sending a briefing note round to the participants that signed in today.